There is a difference between reading the Scripture for devotional interest, for your own self-edification, and trying to put the Scripture into a historical context. But the way in which this is portrayed, and Jesus interrupted, is if these are two completely irreconcilable ways of reading Scripture, one of which embraces history and the other of which pays little attention to it, is probably overdrawn. We have gained a lot, and evangelicals recognize this from the historical study of the Scripture, from putting them in their proper historical context. And there are scholars all around the world, evangelical, moderate, and liberal, who all read the text in this historical, critical manner, and yet disagree about the conclusions and the way we come to conclusions about this material. Obviously, one of the key elements here is worldview. If you view God as a construct of humanity in one way, or think that He may not exist or does not exist, so that you cannot factor in His activity as a historical matter, then you're obviously going to read the Bible very differently than someone who thinks that God exists and acts, and that these acts are capable of description in Scripture. It is generally true that as a matter of historical method, we tend to work first with a model that we're used to and not try and, if you will, project divine causality onto events. But certain events claim to be divinely caused, take place in such a way that divine causality is at the center of what is being talked about, and force a decision one way or the other. The outstanding example of this in Christian teaching is the resurrection, where the idea is that Jesus has been raised to life by God, that there's an empty tomb to prove it, and that there are witnesses who went there and found the tomb empty, who reported it. They weren't immediately well received for the report. There was a lot of doubt and skepticism associated with that. So this isn't a case of a story coming and saying, well, of course we have Jesus here. He's raised. He's the divine Son of God. What should we expect? But in fact, we get reactions very much like a modern person. The women who are initially reported are viewed as being hysterical and emotionally overwrought. When Thomas hears it later, he says he won't believe it unless he sees it himself. And so these reports have built into them the skepticism that would normally come with such a claim. And then we watch the disciples actually work through that. We can look at that historically and look at some of the details associated with that event, and we can say there are good reasons to suspect that something very unusual happened. The idea that this event starts off with women being witnesses at the empty tomb is a cultural disconnect. And what I mean by that is the alternative model is that the church made up the resurrection, created a resurrection to have a living Jesus who wouldn't have existed otherwise in order to keep Jesus alive, to keep hope alive, if you will. And the fact that women start off this process is not something you would do if you were creating a story from scratch. Women didn't have the right to be witnesses in a court of law, and you're trying to sell a difficult idea, resurrection, to a culture that doesn't believe it. So if you were making this up and you were launching a PR campaign to try and make this happen as a matter of propaganda, you wouldn't start with women being the first witnesses to this event as a part of the story unless women were a part of the story, because it doesn't culturally work. That's one example of the type of thing we're talking about. A second example that supports the historicity of the resurrection is the idea of resurrection within Judaism. Within Judaism, resurrection was seen as something that comes at the end of history, not in the midst of history with a particular individual. And it would have been very possible to create a story, because remember the alternative model is that the church creates this story. It didn't really happen. So you could have created a story in which there's a resurrection at the end, and Jesus simply runs the resurrection at the end. You still would have had your Jesus alive, your Jesus to whom you're accountable eventually, etc. But you would have lost a lot of difficult detail along the way, such as Jesus being resurrected in the midst of history. So the question becomes, where does this mutation in Jewish resurrection expectation come from if there wasn't an event that triggered it, something that really took place that explains this transformation of the disciples? In fact, that is the third feature that points to the credibility of this event, the transformation of the disciples, particularly someone like Saul, who was so opposed to the Christian movement that he persecuted it until he experienced directly a vision of the Lord himself that transformed his entire worldview in an instant, and he went from being a persecutor to being among the persecuted for holding to this faith. So there are a variety of ways in which the historical background actually can help us understand these texts and even their unusual nature, because the discussion I've just went through with the women and the resurrection are part of the historical background of texts. So it's possible to use historical critical method, interact with the text, understand the text better against that background, and at the same time still embrace the text's testimony as being fundamentally trustworthy.